this one is a major enterprise. It's a big task. It's not something that comes up every day, and it's kind of what you might call a classic piece of guitar modification with a history behind it. And because it's a mod, there's going to be about 1.2% of the viewership that will find themselves deeply offended by it. And as usual, I caution that they do not own this guitar, and ultimately they have no say in its fate. This is a Martin guitar from 1934. It's an R18 model. These were Martin's attempt to get in with the jazz crowd. A little late, a little less than convincing, sort of. Gibson had a lock on the market by that point. And some of the choices Martin made feel a bit conservative and kind of half-hearted almost. It's like they knew they should, but they really want to. To begin with, these are not carved top instruments. They were press molded. And the braces in here have a lot to do with sort of keeping them the shape they are. They've got flat backs. The other thing is they don't have a raised fingerboard, which by the mid-30s Gibson was more or less fully invested in. Martin kept the fingerboard extension here glued to the body like a flat top, which kind of limits the geometry, the height of the bridge and such. So they don't really give you that swing era chomp that people needed if they were playing unamplified in a 12-piece dance band competing with horns. Not to say that they're an unpleasant sounding guitar. They're not. They sound good. But they don't exemplify the sound of their era. They did sell pretty well though. They made up a good percentage of Martin's sales from the mid-30s to about 1945, I believe, was the last year they produced them. They were made with care and a focus on quality construction like we expect from the Martin Guitar Company. However, these are worth about, well, around 1/10 of what corresponding flat-top Martins bring from this golden era of the 1930s. In fact, the best examples of these now on Reverb are worth less than the cost of a brand new 0018. It's been that way for a very long time. At some point in the 1960s, someone, probably legendary San Francisco Bay Area guitar dealer John Lundberg, recognized that these were made from the exact same materials and came out of the exact same molds as those extremely valuable pre-war Martin guitars. So why not take this fairly undesirable arch top and outfit it with a standard flat top, a Renault mod? Now Lundberg certainly had a hand in doing flat top conversions to the largest size archtop Martin made in the late 30s, the F model, which is essentially shaped like an OM guitar with dreadnought size proportions. It's a very big instrument. Martin eventually started building those themselves in the 70s as the Model M. So Lundberg would have had Mario Martello, who is another legendary repair guy, doing the actual conversions for him. So there's a precedent for altering these. Those Lundberg recreations are quite desirable now and go for big money. Guitar nerds being the way they are, there is a debate to be had that's probably akin to what happens in the vintage car world if someone takes, say, a 1928 Model A and creates a hot rod out of it, rather than, say, a careful and accurate restoration to the factory specs. But for the most part, the loudest people in the conversation generally don't own the guitars in question. They don't actually buy into the market or have the skill necessary to do the work in either case. So, to be clear, converting one of these things takes as much or more effort and know-how than actually building a comparable guitar. And of course, another side of the story is that recently people have awakened to the idea that it might be a good thing to try and make use of the older, less expensive guitars and upgrade them through rebracing, X-brace conversions and such, in a way to conserve the rare, valuable tropical woods that were employed in these things. One of the elder statesmen of the American classical guitar community, Jeff Elliott, wrote an article once where he intimated that it was practically the duty of builders to retop old and worn out classical guitars made from Brazilian rosewood because it was the moral and ethical thing to do. In the end, I've been approached by the owner of this guitar, and he wants me to convert it to a flat top using as much skill and attention that I can muster, and that seems like a reasonable goal. You know, I've got period appropriate woods and adhesives, and I'll do my best to make it work and, you know, try to evoke some of that 1930s Martin mystique. There's one major consideration, or maybe even a concession, for this work, and that has to do with the neck angle on these things. You know, they're pitched back quite a lot, and in order for this to work, we need to do what is effectively a reverse neck reset. You know, we're going to take angle away rather than increase it, and that can have the effect of shifting the 14th fret inwards toward the bridge. It won't be in line with the edge of the body anymore. They sometimes end up being like 13.5 fret guitars rather than 14. So, you know, this fret might end up just past where this, you know, pearl dot is. He's willing to make that concession. The other thing is, you can see that the contour of the sides has been shaped to reflect the arch of the top and bend it into the curve and hold it there. This is opposed to standard arch top guitars, which typically have straight sides, and they're usually untapered. So we're also going to have to cut the sides and the linings straight again to make it work with a flat top. We can't just simply put a new top on this thing. We also have to shape the entire box. And the soundboard on this example has some fairly wide grain, and it's cut considerably off quarter. So they weren't using the premium grade wood for these tops, probably because they realized it was going to get the shaded finish treatment, which is Martin's version of a sunburst. And also, I mean, having the more flexible off quarter, you know, they didn't need the stiff top. It might have actually worked against them when they were trying to press it into this shape and make it conform to the curve. So a loose floppy top would be okay. It's also kind of, well, it's a funky sort of shape. It's very flat in the center here and then breaks off quite considerably, probably in the same way that a Macaferri guitar does, so that it could get, you know, some decent break angle for the bridge from the tailpiece. But it's also distorted in a number of areas. I don't quite trust that it looks anything like it did originally. There is quite a considerable arch in it. Are we going to miss the top? I don't think so. I'm going to start by taking the neck off this instrument. One, because it has to happen sometime, and two, because I need to derive an outline of the sides, which will be easier without the neck. Anytime we take the top or back off a guitar, there's going to be a release of inner tensions that can sometimes cause the sides to spread out or otherwise change shape. With guitars, we're usually removing the back to do work on the inside because, well, it's easier to get at, maybe a little bit less messy, and if there is some slight deviation from the original outline, people aren't going to notice as much. But in this case, I need a form or a mold to keep things as accurate as possible. Removing the neck should go as usual. However, in this case, we have a guitar with bar frets. This is one of the very last guitars that would have received them. 1934 is the last year. I don't really want to remove the 15th fret if I don't have to. You guys have seen me completely refret a bar fretted guitar, so you'll remember that these necks derive a lot of their strength and stiffness and their shape from varying the width of each fret in the slot. It works like a system, and getting the fit right takes some practice and some time. So rather than drilling through the fret slot in this case, I'm going to leave the fret in and we're just going to drill to the side of it. We've got a nice sort of dark colored board here, and it should not be difficult to disguise the holes. I let things heat up per usual using my foam cutters from hotwirefoamfactory.com. Takes about 10 minutes, and the neck came free very easily. I chopped away a portion of the soundboard in front of the neck block to see if I was going to be in luck, and I was. There is a center line on there. That's very helpful because it really lets me dial in the true center line of the body, which may or may not align perfectly with the center line of the top. In this case, it's pretty darn close though. It's not so easy tracing the outline of an arch top, or really any instrument. I've made up a little cradle that supports the body on some height adjustable blocks that I can try and get them the same height from side to side above the bench and adjust them so that the sides are more or less at right angles to the paper. That's relative because at this point in the instrument's life there's usually some distortion, like the sides will have cupped or bowed slightly, but we do our best to average it all out. And the cradle has been taped and glued to a center line on the paper so that I could move this thing around and do the other side with ease, and it's not going to shift. To do the actual tracing, I get to use this little jig I came up with years ago, and I was very proud of myself when I did. I had it all figured out. This has got a straight contacting surface that is planed down to about 1/16 of an inch or so. And below that is a landing that is in the same plane, and that supports half a pencil, which rides in a little track made to keep it on center. And the rubber bands pull it against that surface and also provide some downward pressure to give it a little bit of spring and keep it in contact with the paper. This setup works because the body is held high enough that it's going to clear the pencil, and I'll be able to cut the template to the outside of the line and get a really quite reasonably accurate mold. So I adjusted the center line on the guitar with some center lines on the blocks. Obviously the tracing device isn't going to go right up to the center line, but in these areas on both the top and bottom, that 1.5 inches is usually pretty straight, and I'll be able to figure that out after it's traced out. So at this point, just keeping the flat surface against the side. Oops. With the tracing done, I'll pull the guitar out of the cradle so that you can see what that looks like. It's pretty simple. Okay, at this point there are two different ways I can go. If I was going to use this as a template to derive a new model from, I would probably just cut down the center line and use 1/2 by flipping it over so that things were absolutely symmetrical. But because this is a repair, I want to maintain the outline as much as possible to what's there, so I'm going to cut around this and use it to make the mold. If I want to get really finicky, I can grab my profile gauge and use that to transfer the outline. However, we're going to find that in the Martin guitar design, that area of the block is pretty flat, such that a straight line will suffice. Cutting to the line just takes a new blade and a steady hand and some patience. Just for interest's sake, I folded the resultant cutout in half on the center line to see if there's any deviation, and there is. Around the waist and the widest area of the bouts, the outline is stretched here and there just a little bit. Next, I tested it on the body itself, and that fits nice and snug. I bandsawed the outline from some stack laminated plywood, so it's about 1.5 inches thick. And here I'm using a pocket hole jig for screwing it together. That's quite a lot of work, but I think it's probably worth it. Things fit snugly. Here you can see the high point in the center of the instrument, around the waist, which needs to be flattened out. The finished surface on the sides is not in pristine shape, but I felt it was probably a good idea to score the lacquer around the edge of the binding, as I'm going to be removing it. This is probably not strictly necessary, but I think it will help keep things clean as I separate the top from the sides or the rims. Unlike what we see on a lot of contemporary Martin builds, binding adhesion did not seem to be an issue back in the day. This is really welded into the grain. It's melted in there. Now that I've exposed the seam between the top and side wood, I can slip in my thin palette knife and separate the joint. The old hide glue cracks very cleanly with just a little prying. Of course, every once in a while you run into a brace end and you have to work a bit harder to get around it. For the taller or more obstinate brace ends, I will cut along either side and then pare down with the scalpel at an angle, slicing through the brace end. Let's have a quick inspection of the top here. It's not dissimilar to flat top bracing of this era. Got the single tone bar here. The X brace is quite a bit taller than you'd find on a flat top. And also, like the last Martin arch top we opened up a couple years ago, this one's got a major split in one arm of the X. And you see the little linen patch here on the top is split along with the wood. And the whole thing has come up. Not the easiest thing to repair in situ. And the upper transverse brace I think was loose for a portion of its length as well. There is a signature which is indecipherable. This is interesting. There's a little black pod or something. Some kind of chrysalis. I was later informed that this is definitely a cockroach egg sac. Nice. For an archtop instrument, this is incredibly thin. Seems to average around 135 thousandths, 140, which is basically about half what you'd find in a lot of Gibsons. Very lightly built. Of course, this was forced into this shape with a heated mold. And then, I mean, the braces are what keeps it fairly arched. Inside the box there are more of these little chrysalis things. That's what I'm assuming they are. Thankfully, there were no live occupants. I think it's fun and interesting that they added the bridge pad in its usual location on a guitar that of course would never have bridge pins, and whose bridge itself was completely supported by the X-brace members. In much the same way that they labeled the interior with the standard branding iron in the usual spot, which is of course completely invisible in this guitar. See the designation there, the R18. Other interesting things. There's this block of mahogany which has been glued on top of the lining to support the pickguard screw, and it seems to be just another piece of the lining itself which has been upended. It hasn't been curved and glued in place, but the screw hole is pretty close to the end here, kind of overshot the mark. There are witness lines from moisture intrusion along the bottom end here and on the block and on this side as well. This sometimes happens in guitars which have been left in basements on a wet floor or a damp floor or on concrete. Sometimes it'll even soak right through the case, but we're lucky in that the structure seems to be undamaged. The brace ends remain nicely tucked into the lining. Everything is solid. The box is in really good shape. What I've done is I've selected points on both ends of the guitar and brought them level with the mold, giving me my low points, as it were, and I'm simply going to plane off all the excess material so it ends up flush with the surface. The surfaces of the blocks themselves were cut at an oblique angle, again to help make the arch conform. So I've got to bring that down level as well. I need to stop every once in a while and get down low and check and see what's going on. I also want to check and make sure the sides have remained perpendicular to the mold and that it hasn't slipped to one side, creating a wedge shape or something. I intentionally left the inside corner of the lining high and I'll darken that with a marker. This is a big flat board with sandpaper on it, and I'm going to level the entire surface. That's why the marker comes in handy. It lets me see what I've sanded. On instruments of more modern design, this will sometimes be a big concave workboard, which is a portion of a sphere. You can see the high points. Let's have a look at the neck geometry. I'll use a miter gauge and we'll check that with a protractor. It appears to be in the neighborhood of 7 degrees. I'm going to need to start the neck off with something around 1 degree, so you can see there's quite a lot of material to remove. Using a sharp chisel, I'll just pare back to the line in a series of steps. I'll try to end up with a slightly undercut surface as well, which will mean less sanding when it comes time to fit the neck against the sides of the body. Here I'm measuring the previous approximate length of the dovetail, and I'll transfer that mark over. I'll saw off the excess wood, which would prevent the dovetail from actually seating in the pocket. Here I'm measuring the newly established length of the fingerboard extension, which will be important for computations. Some material to work with. This is Adirondack or red spruce, the same species Martin used in the 1930s. This happens to be a AAA grade board. They don't come cheap because they're very rare. Saying that, this doesn't look the same as an equivalent AAA board from the 1930s might have looked. The grading system has problems. Anyway, Martin was working with old-growth timber that began life in the first half of the 19th century, whereas this tree here probably took root at about the same time as that guitar was made, 1930s maybe? And it looks different. The grain lines are farther apart. In the second half of the 20th century, winters got shorter, less severe. The temperatures got warmer, of course, and the growing season became longer. Therefore, the tree had more time each year to add circumference to the trunk. You may know that winters in the 1800s could be very long and very cold, and there were several years, in North America at least, where spring basically didn't come until June. The history is written in the heart of each tree, right? There's a field of study called dendrochronology, which analyzes grain patterns between the populations of various species of trees. And that can be useful in archaeological terms for dating things made out of wood, like architectural beams or furniture, and it's actually very precise. So this is kind of the state of the woodcutter's art at the moment. This is what you get for a AAA board. It's a good board. It's well quartered and pretty stiff. I think it will make a nice guitar. The grain is reasonably straight. It does curve in towards the center line a little bit at this end. There are, 8 to 10 grain lines per inch. Fairly consistent. Some variance. What that allows me to do is try and find a pair of lines on either side here that are wide enough and straight enough for me to cut a straight line between the rings. It looks better if you don't have them converging into each other on the soundboard. Not that that's the end of the world if they do, but we try, right? And up here there are some wiggles from a knot. It's moved over here on this board. So I want to put that in the upper bout for a couple of reasons. Number one, the outline is probably not going to come anywhere near it, but there are some wiggles that can sort of get telegraphed through the wood. And generally speaking, the upper bout in a guitar is less acoustically active. So if there's any kind of weird stuff going on in the grain, I'd rather have it on the upper side of the guitar. Yeah, so there's one grain line here that looks like we can get all the way down the board without hitting it. So that's where I'm going to make a mark and we'll cut it off there. Now I'm using a shooting board with a hand plane. Plane down to the line. The plane's set for a very fine cut, and I'm going to strive to get a perfectly straight joint. So I've planed one side with the face up, and to plane the other I'll turn it over so the show side is face down. And that way, if there's any little variance in the angle of the plane and the bed of the shooting board. This will sort of cancel that out. So I'm basically planing matching angles into the board. Nicking the corner off one side allows me to find the center line very easily when it's glued together. This is my jig for gluing up plates, just a flat surface with two battens on either side into which there are some machine screws. I run the outside screws in so that the center of the board lifts off the table by about ½ an inch or so. I just come back and snug up all the other screws so they touch the edges. And when I push this down, I got good solid contact all along the center seam. I'll come along and clamp a flat batten down the center to hold things in position till the glue dries. There are other ways of making this joint. You can use a router with a straight edge. Some people will sand it. I personally think the hand plane is the way to go. You get a cleaner joint. It's tighter at the end of the day, and I don't know why you would use one of the other methods. I don't see a reason to do that. Push that down. Wipe off a little bit of the extra glue. And then I got this plate joining clamping bar. This is lightly curved on the underside. It's a camber so that it's going to put pressure down in the center of the board even though I only clamp it on the ends. Here I'm laminating some veneer sheets for purfling lines in the rosette and around the body. This is black dyed pear and hard maple. The main trick with this is to get it clamped up quickly between some flat battens and let it dry for a very long time, so all the moisture in the glue has a chance to be absorbed and then released, and it'll remain flat. If you take it out of clamps in, say, 1 or 2 days, it'll curl up in some very frustrating ways. So I try and let it sit for at least 3 weeks in the clamps. I can take some of them off later if I need them. The decorative lines in martins of this vintage are quite narrow. These solid black lines here are going to be the inner and outer rings, and those are going to fit into a channel that's a 32nd of an inch wide. I'm going to make them about 2/1000ths narrower than that to account for a little bit of expansion that happens. These are being compressed by my sizer, and they will expand when the glue hits them. So they want to be borderline loose fit in the channel. So I'm just going back. I'll be resizing every line, obviously. These started off about 40/1000ths wide. Currently that's 36, so I got a ways to go. So the lines enter the scraping jig somewhere in their center, and I pull to the end. I flip them over regularly, trying to take a similar amount off both sides. So I'm laying out the rosette lines in the sound hole position. The soundboard at this point has been block sanded with a great big flat block and 120 grit paper. So it's flat, but it's nowhere near the final surface. You know, there's bound to be some scratches caused by the rotating base plate on my router and the leveling of the inlaid lines. So we'll get rid of those later with the actual sanding process. The other thing, the soundboard is still 125/1000ths thick, just over 3 millimeters. It makes sense to get the lines installed when it is thick, because sometimes the glue can actually swell things a bit and cause warpage. Thicker is easier to work with. After that, we'll turn the board over and do the actual thicknessing on the underside. When that's done, we can come back and final sand the visible surfaces. This is something you learn as a classical maker using red cedar, which is an incredibly soft wood that is super prone to denting, so the order of operations becomes pretty important. Now then, how do I know where to cut the rings? How big are they going to be? Well, I took a careful measurement of the length of the fingerboard extension, realizing that this guitar is maybe not exactly the same as the usual situation. The fretboard is going to be pushed this way a little bit. It's very difficult to find this kind of information. You know, you won't find commercial plans online, or if you do, they'll be of a much younger guitar, maybe from the 60s, or they'll be very unreliable. Because dimensions shifted, materials shifted over the years. Probably the best thing to do is to look up photos of actual guitars, because the people who own these are usually quite proud of them. They'll take a lot of pictures, and when they're sold, usually some really good photos have to be taken, you know, because these things go for big money. If you look at enough of those, you can start making generalizations, and it's actually possible, if you get a good frontal shot like this, to blow it up to dimensions that are 1-to-1. You know, they're going to match. Like in this case, I know this sound hole is going to be 3 3/4 of an inch. That's a constant. And from that, I can start to make a pretty close guesstimate as to the dimensions of the rings and the spacing in between them. Like, if you look at this, you'll note that this isn't an equal spacing. The space between the outer ring and the center here is larger than the one that comes between it and the sound hole. That kind of stuff matters, really, visually. Also, you note things like these are black and white lines in the interior portion of the rosette, but the blacks are much thinner, giving us an overall effect that is pretty light in color. The visual effect is light. It reads light. Later on, the black lines got thicker. And this is sort of true nerd stuff, but you have to decide how far you're willing to take it, you know. Anyway, I think I've got the materials dimensioned to something pretty close to the original. I'm using a simple compass jig for a laminate trimmer. There's a metal pin in its base that goes through a hole in the soundboard and registers in a bushing sunk into a plywood base. And I'm using a spiral downcut bit, 32nd of an inch in diameter, which produces a pretty clean result. I'll glue in the collection of veneer lines to create the rings. I'm using slightly thinned Titebond original glue and work my way around the circumference. These lines are a little bit thicker than the channel into which they're going. The channel itself is about 1.5 millimeters. They're about maybe 2.5 millimeters tall. At the top end, which will eventually be covered by the fingerboard extension, I'll just lop them off. No need for extreme precision here, but it's nice if there's not a great big gap at the end. Following that, I'll top glue them with some more thinned glue, which is going to seep down into them, swell them up, and lock them into place. Okay, this is all dry. Looks a little too bold, doesn't it? That's an optical illusion. The glue has swollen the lines above the channel, but when I pare it back, you see the effect in better detail. What about using super glue? You can. The issue is sometimes super glue will wick into the end grain areas, and it can really stain the spruce. You really see it. It's an effect that doesn't go away either. So conventional wisdom is, if you want to do that, you should seal the channels first with some shellac or something to prevent that absorption. I've always just used regular woodworking glue. I'll finish the leveling with a cabinet scraper. This takes off wispy fine shavings and helps keep things flat, and it actually leaves a very beautiful looking surface. With the soundboard now sanded, I can go back and cut the sound hole out using a handheld compass cutter. It's got a pin that fits into a bushing and a workboard, and a little knife blade which protrudes not that deeply So there's good support right around the cut. I've set it for the diameter I want. And the first cut is very light. It's just a score line, basically. And the subsequent revolutions are going to deepen it. The light cut is necessary because there's a great difference in density between the late growth lines of the spruce and the early growth. So every time it passes one of those dark grain lines, it wants to sort of kick the knife blade away from like a concentric path. This could be done with the router cutter too, of course, but I don't know. I just get a kick out of doing it this way. I'll turn it over and do the other side. I'll just break that sharp corner with some fine sandpaper. I'm establishing the ultimate length of the soundboard from the neck by measuring the fingerboard extension and figuring out where I want that to end, which is approximately on the first purfling line here around the sound hole. And this will give me an accurate place to measure from for things like my scale length, my bridge position, and that sort of thing, and the bracing. So it's important to remember that this is a conversion. I can't just take measurements from a plan and transfer them to this soundboard because they won't line up with what's actually going on in real life here. So this bracing pattern is an adaptation, keeping certain critical proportions in line with what we know about old Martins. You know, things like I can't just start plotting out the scale length from the theoretical 14th fret here, assuming this is the body joint, because as we mentioned before, it's not. You know, the actual body joint is somewhere around 13.5 frets. And if I used it like you normally would, I could be as much as 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters off. You know, that's especially important, you know, when you're dealing with the bridge plate position or the location for the saddle, right? So there's the actual 14th fret point. And here's the saddle location. I think one of the critical dimensions or positioning things is where the arms of the X brace cross the wings of the bridge. You know, you can either have them touching just the tips, like in certain earlier Martins. By this stage, they were sort of holding up a little bit more meat underneath the wings. They're sort of positioned in the center here, which gives a little bit more support for steel strings. If you were to use a bracing pattern from 1920, might not be sufficiently strong using all the other same dimensions. So I've plotted those, and I know roughly where their intersection should be. We talk about forward shifted bracing in Martin guitars, and that describes a slight change in brace position that happened in the mid-30s. But I think the intersection with the bridge is really the important part. I'm splitting off pieces from this very old chunk of Sitka spruce for some bracing material. This is to limit the amount of grain run out that can happen in a brace. This piece has a bit of a localized twist in it right here, which makes it unsuitable. This portion here is fine, as is this portion here, but you wouldn't want to make a brace that would cut through. You know, you'd end up with a very weak section. These pieces split from a different blank are more suitable for my X brace. They're straighter, there's no twist in them. I think they'll do nicely. The goal when doing all of this planing is to maximize the verticality of the grain lines running through the brace and making sure that it's straight and with the grain. Okay, we're going to get into braces. Now we come to something that might be a little hard to explain. Most people understand that the term flat top guitar is kind of a misnomer, and that usually they have a bit of an arch to the soundboard. And in fact, most contemporary instruments have soundboards that are shaped into a radius. So it's a portion of a sphere. Fairly tight radius too. Could be 28 feet, sometimes 21, or their metric equivalent. Earlier Gibsons had quite an extreme radius. It's around 18 feet. Martins, however, don't. There's a builder I admire, I think he's semi-retired now, called John Graven. He points out that a lot of people go chasing after the vintage Martin sound, upholding pre-war Martins as the pinnacle of acoustic tone, but people get kind of put off by the idea of building them the way that Martin did. They'll use the bracing pattern, but throw away the top radius specs and get out their deeply dished workboards. Because pre-war Martin tops, though they have a tiny arch and they distort over time into something more curved, are really close to flat. It's a 40-foot radius on the braces, which when you look at it, it's almost imperceptible. And what's more, Martin glued those braces against the top, held against a flat workboard. Now they're going to spring a little bit when the clamps are released, and it's more like they're designed to have a kind of springy preload against string tension in a flat state, rather than being a radius, at least to start off with. If we build guitars in the usual humidity conditions guitars are expected to live in, the number is usually presumed to be about 45% humidity, then everything should be fine. But with a very flat top like we find on the old Martins, that might not be enough. Jean Larrivée had some fantastic humidity controls in his Vancouver factory, which is a very wet place. He was also very adamant that assembly work should stop if the humidity rose above a certain number. I think it was around 43%. Still, I have repaired a tremendous number of Larrivées with soundboard cracks. So when it comes to bracing acoustic soundboards, I do it in much lower humidity than is standard. I've turned off my humidifier. It's the middle of winter. The shop today is around 31% humidity. That means this guitar is going to be assembled close to the lowest humidity it should ever reasonably expect to see in regular use. It's dry. That might mean it needs an action adjustment come summertime. I'm going to set it up pretty low here in the middle of winter with the expectation that it will swell up a little bit. We have to find a kind of middle ground where the guitar is going to be happy both summer and winter and not start to buzz or be outrageously difficult to play. That's one of the things with old Martins. But the thing is, it shouldn't suffer cracks. So how do I cut the radius on my braces? I don't have a 40-foot workboard. I think 40 feet is difficult to find in the commercially prepared ones these days. You can make your own, of course, but it's so close to flat that it doesn't even seem like... That seems like a lot of wasted effort. I use a jig which I found in a Guild of American Luthiers journal a long, long time ago. I'm sorry, I don't remember which one it was. And I'm not going to go digging for it right now because I don't have time. This thing has an interior strip which is glued to one side that has the radius on it, and it basically squeezes the brace. I put the one I want to cut in there. I lock it up tightly, but not super tight at this point, and actually flex it down into the radius. Sometimes it's necessary to use a clamp to do that. Then I tighten up the butterfly things here, and I'm going to plane this. This has been flexed into the radius. I'm going to plane the top surface straight. When I take it out of the jig, it'll spring back and have the 40-foot radius, which again is very slight. I drew a little line of pencil on the top there so I can mark my progress. This is my 5 1/4 Veritas Junior Jack plane, and doesn't take much. You can see that I'm going to only remove material at the ends for the first couple of passes because those are flexed up. This is set for a light cut. So I'll do this for the X braces and the tone bars. And here's where we're going to leave it for this week. Next week we'll glue all this stuff together. We'll work on the binding, we'll make a bridge, we'll do the setup and the finishing and all the other fun stuff that comes along with this kind of project. So we'll see you again. Thanks for watching.